Alright guys, today I have a pretty cool basic build for you. I know a lot of you guys are familiar with my custom dive gear. So today we're going to be doing some dive tank repair and customization, along with how to make a weight belt for your G.I. Joes as well. So just to get started, I know a lot of you guys are familiar with the different tank variations that Hasbro released for the G.I. Joe Adventure Team and G.I. Joe over the years from 64 to 76. Here's the earlier versions, the two tanks with the plastic backplate, obviously missing the rebreather and tank pipes, or whatever you want to call them, nozzles. So this is an older tank. And then we had the newer tanks from the mid-70s, which would utilize those black rubber straps that a lot of us are super familiar with. Those straps, you go ahead and grab one, like these right here. At least I've cut these off. Those straps over time would react with the plastics from those substandard plastics of the 70s and cause significant melt marking and section loss in a lot of these plastic tanks. And then there's the latest issue tank, which was pretty cheap. This is a busted and broken out one that I'll restore and repair as well in this video. And you've also got situations where you tried to take the black harness off the tanks and busted it out. So you've got a lot of different repairs that these tanks, when you get them in lots, different states of repair that these tanks, when you get them in lots, come in. So we're going to go ahead and do a few of these tanks and customize them, repair them, whatnot, like I do. When you see my Watts in the shops, you see a lot of the completed versions of those tanks. So this will be a kind of a video in which we kind of go through a really quick step-by-step process of how we do that. And along with that, I'll be showing you guys how I make my custom weight belts as well. So we'll go ahead and pause the video and we'll come back and we'll start talking about how we're going to do one of these tanks. Alright, welcome back guys. So let's start off talking about these dive tanks and what common problems that we have with them. We'll go ahead and use these earlier issue dive tanks. This one here obviously is missing the valve assembly for the oxygen hoses, so we'll have to manufacture a new one of these. So this is one of the later issue tanks that they had for the Defenders line, and it came with this pretty cheaply made one-piece oxygen setup. Just kind of slides down in the tank like so. Very cheap, but functional. So what I did is I took this apart and I created a two-part mold of that dive tank. I actually filled the back of this in with clay and molded it so I could make castings for replacement pieces. And here's one that I've just finished. Turns out pretty well. I mean, it's a little rougher. I need to take a razor knife and clean it all up and do some sanding, but this is what the finished product will look like. And then I'll have to do some tooling on this piece to mount it to this here. So we'll have a nice oxygen regulator set up for this tank. That's kind of how I go about doing some of these repairs. I find pieces that I can duplicate and put back together. This is a really simple thing to mold, since it's really a one-piece mold. Very different from these portions here, which are a little more detailed. You got the regulator, then you got your pipe set up with your valve handle here, which is really hard to mold. So I usually stick build that if it's missing, using some styrene, which we'll show later on. So that's what we're going to do with the silver tank. We'll make a new regulator piece for it. We'll mount it to here, and then this will basically be done. We'll save it talk about hoses later and whatnot. So that's kind of how I handle these tanks here, these old vintage style silver tanks. We'll come back and we'll talk about the white tanks. Okay, welcome back. So as I mentioned in the intro, these white tanks used to have this really shitty rubber strap which would react with the plastic in the tanks and cause melt marks and section loss within the tanks. So that's one thing you have to really deal with when you get a lot of these old vintage items. A lot of these are like this. If a guy really wanted to be perfect, you could take some sandpaper, sand these down, try to fill in any of the voids caused by the plastic melt, then resand it a few times to get a nice smooth tank. I'm not really interested in going to all that work because, you know, it is what it is. I kind of want to preserve the vintage style, vintage damage to the tanks that we all are familiar with as kids and as collectors. So I don't usually mess with a lot of that. I do take some really fine sandpaper and I do sand these tanks up as best I can to get enough of the section loss out of there so it looks a lot better when I paint it. And obviously I don't utilize these straps anymore. What I have done is I've managed to pry off a clean backing plate for the scuba tanks. And what I do is I take that scuba tank and I get some sheet styrene, trace it on there, cut the tank out, or cut the backer plate out, and then I have a duplicate for this backer plate. So I use styrene to make duplicates. Then what I do is I will just mount that to this tank and it'll be almost like those old vintage style tanks we talked about a bit ago. So I go ahead and make new plates for all these dive tanks and then we'll mount them. Usually how I mount these, it's pretty simple. You can see this already has pre-drilled holes in it, but I take some rubber bands So I'll take a couple thick rubber bands. I'll just go ahead and kind of demonstrate it. And then I use those rubber bands to kind of position the plate. Can't talk for some reason. Position the plate where I want it. And then I have one of these jeweler's drills, push drill, whatever you want to call it. Then I go ahead and drill out all the holes. And then I mount it with mount it with styrene rod. You'll see how I do that a little later too. So yeah, it's pretty simple. I prefer the old style plate backing for the scuba tanks in lieu of the shitty rubber ones. I just think it looks better and it works better. So that's how I kind of reproduce those. I also wanted to show you a primed version of a tank with this recast oxygen regulator. I talked about that in the previous video on how I reproduce these oxygen regulators. So here's a good example of what that looks like when you get it all primed. But anyways, so what I'll do with these is I'll sand these down and I will clean them up and then prime them and start figuring out what color I want and then work on these plates and then get all those mounted or painted and then mounted, and then we'll keep moving on with the other items we'll go over on these basic build dive tank restorations. Alright, welcome back. So let's talk about dive belts. This is really something we really never got a lot of in the G.I. Joe Adventure Team accessory sets. And I've known a lot of guys who've made some really cool dive belts. Very authentic looking ones. And they can be kind of pricey. So I actually came up with my own dive belt design, or two of them actually, to be honest. One I liked from the start, but I didn't know if it would be very appealing to anybody else. Talk about it briefly. I took the old lead weights from the deep sea dive belt set, just put a small piece of styrene rod in there, and then I cast or molded and casted it to make these vintage, old-timey style dive belt weights. This actually works pretty good on a figure. I don't really know how people will receive these, but I kind of like the way they look. But I know it might not be everybody's cup of tea. So then I actually decided to make a more traditional dive belt, as you can see here. What I did, I took some polyclay and just shaped out what I considered to be a cool dive belt set. I kind of searched on the internet for different dive belt weights, and then I made this one right here. And then I did a molding of it in this really quick set silicone mold compound. I'll show you what I used in case you guys are interested. I use this for a lot of really simple molds. It's easy mold silicone putty. It comes in 2 parts. Got it on Amazon. You just kind of, it's like epoxy in a sense. You just measure out 2 parts of the same volume, then mold them together in your hand, and it's kind of how I did with this. And then I just pressed down this into the mold, let it sit up. It sits up really quick, like in 10 minutes. So I did 2 of them, and I think, obviously, when you look at my polyclay version of this, it looks very rough. But if you consider those old dive belts, they're all cast lead, so they're going to look dingy and beat up. So I think I captured that ambience pretty well in my dive belts, and I just use a 1/4 inch elastic, and I use a belt loop, a double. I can't remember what you call these. There's a name for this kind of belt buckle, but a loop buckle or whatever. I just use some pieces of metal. You can get it in your hobby stores in the jewelry making department. So that's kind of how I do these. It's a really simple thing to do. I just mold these, or cast them. Here's the casting of one, and then I go back and I hand paint them all with. These are done with silver leafing paint, which kind of pops, and it goes along pretty well with the shininess of the belt buckle. So it's a really, really simple weight belt design. I like it. I've made a lot of them. I really like the way they've turned out. They look really nice on a G.I. Joe diver. So in case you guys are interested in making your own weight belts, this is how I do mine. I'm sure that a lot of you guys out there can utilize 3D printed versions, or do a better job of sculpting and molding your own. I'm not the greatest sculptor in the world, but I try, and I think they turned out great. So that's how I do my dive belts. Just wanted to go over that with you guys. Okay, welcome back. So as I mentioned earlier, on these dive tanks you'd have these little valve pieces, and those are broken off quite a bit on these. So I tried to make my own pieces, and I don't know, they turned out decent, but as you can see here, I've just taken and drilled a small hole in this portion where the old one was, and I'll just clip off a little bit of that piece of rod, styrene rod. Then I have these 2 pieces of sheet styrene I've cut, and I will glue those to this portion. I'll glue one on top of the other, so I'll plate them to give it a little more thickness, and then I'll just take a file and I'll shape that. Sorry for the camera work there, guys. I'll shape that to where it gets close to this valve shape. I'll do my best, but obviously I use Plasti-Weld when I do that with any of the styrene stuff that hasn't been painted. So that's how I do my valve replacements. Again, there might be people who have a better way to do it than me. This is just how I do this stuff. So we'll pause it real quick and I'll come back and show you what that looks like. Okay guys, welcome back. So you can see I've taken the plastic weld and there's styrene plates, and I've made it all kind of work together. Sorry for that. So then I take a file and I'll just slowly file all this around to kind of shape it out to make it look close to that valve here. So we'll see how it turns out. I think it'll turn out pretty cool looking. Obviously it doesn't have to be perfect. So the next step on this tank obviously is to mount this regulator on the back, which will clean this one up here. This is the one that was on here. It just was broken off. So we'll mount it. We'll prime it and paint it and mount it. This tank's already been primed and painted. For some reason I just had one of these done. Kind of testing paint colors, so this will be kind of like our go-by tank. It's already had the holes for this plate drilled, so it's essentially ready to be mounted on this plate when the plate's finished. And this will be one of the sets of tanks we basically do in this project, this basic build dive tanks. So we'll pause the video, we'll get this all cleaned up and take a look at how that valve looks, and we'll come back and we'll talk about a few other things. Okay guys, welcome back. So let's talk about this vintage tank that I covered in the very intro part of this video. So these portions have been broken off inside the holes here. What we'll do is we'll drill these out because we're going to have to mount this portion here after I get it all cleaned up. So you got a few different options. So option one is to kind of file these holes down a little bit and then kind of make it work. Or another option is to get some styrene, basically as close to this hole size here. When you get it all drilled out, you can cut these two pegs off flush with these plates, and then get your drill holes close as best in the center as you can, and then just mount this styrene in the drilled hole portions here and just slide it down in those other holes. It's kind of probably the way I'm going to go. This one broke when I was doing some sanding. So it's got a broken part here. I'm not going to mess with it. I'm just going to go ahead and finish these tanks with this. It doesn't really bother me. I mean, these things are not going to look 100% perfect. I'm not a toy manufacturer. I'm not the greatest at certain castings and moldings. I'll be the first to admit that. Where I think my talent, not to toot my own horn, lies, but I'm probably best at painting and decaling. Those kind of the two things that I seem to be pretty proficient at. If I had to fill out the back of my baseball card, that's what I would say about myself. So this will still look fine, it'll look nice, and we'll just get decals and everything on it. So anyways, that's kind of what the plan is with this. We'll come back here after I've drilled this out and mounted this, and I'll just kind of show you how that's all going to go together. Alright, welcome back guys. So I've went ahead and put a couple pieces of styrene in the top here, drilled some holes in the bottom of this. So the next step obviously is to slide that down on these portions here. I'll have to sand these up a little bit so the holes fit nicely, but that's how this will mount to the top there. So that'll be finished, and it'll be a real similar look to this old Defender's tank that I showed you in the intro video that has the portions that slide in the top. So look kind of just like that. Now with this tank here, we'll go ahead and slide this on top here as so. I'll prime this first. I'll get it dry fitted when this all cures, the glue cures, and I'll dry fit this, and then I'll prime this and paint this black, more than likely, because those old vintage style tanks had the black regulator. So that's how this will finish up. So there's not much left to this. It has new elastic strap harness on it, and this will be done, and we'll decal this, and we'll come back and we'll talk about a few of these other tanks we've went over in this basic build video. Okay, real quick, I want to touch on this harness plate. So these notches where your elastic harness will go, how do I cut those out? Well, it's a great question. There's several different ways to do it. I'm going to take a Dremel power tool with a special tip insert, and it kind of just cuts grooves. So I use a steady hand and cut these grooves out. It usually works out pretty well. Then I'll take a razor knife and some sandpaper and some of my files and clean these notches up. But I've done this before. It just takes a really steady hand. I use a Dremel to do this. Now, obviously, you could do it with a razor knife. You can do it with all different sorts of tools. A punch, it doesn't really matter. But I just want you to know that I cut these out with a Dremel. Alright guys, welcome back. Sorry for the jumbled mess here, but I wanted to come back and go over a few things we've done since the previous video. So I went ahead and painted this tank here. It's got the brand new regulator on top, and I went ahead and cut out another backplate harness for it as well. So it's cut out, ready to be finished up, sanded, prepped. So this is this tank here. Set it off to the side. I've also painted the tank where I built the new oxygen valve, as you saw in previous videos. It's done. It's got the holes drilled, ready to mount the plate. Now went ahead and finished this plate here to show you what it's going to look like. It hasn't had its final coat of paint yet, but here's the pegs that I put in there with Plasti-Weld. It's all styrene. The only problem with these plates is they're a little thinner plastic, so they're a little flimsier, but it's going to work out because I've done it before. Now, what I'll do with this one and the one you saw here previously, I'll go ahead and paint this, seal it, and then go ahead and put the elastic harness on it, and then I'll mount it to the tank as so. And then glue it in, and that'll be finished. So this one's here is almost finished. Now, the vintage early release or early edition or first edition G.I. Joe tanks here, when I was doing it, I just discovered that the backplate harness had a crack along the seam of the glue line, so I went ahead and fixed that. I'll sand it down a little bit, and I remolded the oxygen rebreather for it. I didn't like the way the other one turned out, so this snaps down in there, and I'll glue it and finish it as well. Now, I told you about these late issue tanks and the plastic melting and getting a lot of section loss where the rubber harness was. You can see one here that's got significant section loss on both the top and the bottom portions of the tank. I went ahead and took one, I sanded it down as best I could. You can see there's still section loss showing, but this has been primed and to be ready to paint. Now, quick few thoughts on those type of tanks and the section loss that you'll find there. Obviously, you can sand it out. You could fill it in with a mill putty or some kind of putty and sand it out to make it all smooth. It's just going to take a lot of time and effort. I'm really not interested in doing that because these are refurbished tanks and they're going to be battle damaged looking, so, or used looking, not battle damaged. A guy could also buy, Bondo makes a spray that a lot of 3D printers use to get out those 3D print lines, and you can spray the Bondo on there. That'll eventually fill in those low spots and sand that as well. So it just depends on how much work you want to go to as far as making your tanks look the way you want them to. So I just wanted to let you guys know about that. This one here is one I haven't finished yet. This is in the process of being finished. When we come back, I'll probably have this one painted. This one I'll just cast off to the side and not mess with it. I also mentioned that I was going to redo this tank here. Time's not going to permit me to do that, so I'll probably end up doing a separate video on this one, because this is going to be an extensive repair rebuild. So sorry about saying I was going to do that. So the next step obviously is to do some painting and some finishing, and then I have some decals I need to put on. Obviously you've seen hopefully you've seen my decal videos and you know how I do my decaling. If not, you can find it on my on my YouTube page. I used to link to it, but I might still throw a link in there. One last thing, I have made a mold for the rebreathing apparatus. So I've made several of these oxygen rebreathers. So I have those as well made for these tanks. So when we come back, probably be a final video. I'll probably have all these finished up, decaled, and we'll go over some final thoughts on this basic build dive tanks. Okay guys, welcome back. This is the, I guess, final reveal. Before I showcase these tanks, I wanted to talk about that Dremel tool I mentioned when I was making the harness for the straps. I use this little grinding wheel to groove in those slots for the elastic. So I know I didn't talk about that earlier, but I wanted to show this to you guys, because inevitably I'll probably get questions on how I did it. So this is what I used. I just used this Dremel right here. Got it at Walmart, I think. So there you go. Anyways, so here we are with the final tanks. Go ahead and go through each one of them. This is the set of version 1 vintage tanks that I made the brand new oxygen regulator piece for. You can see I've decaled it, added some bells and whistles, put the parachute cord hosing on there, and then I also, in the rebreathers, I use elastic cord. The reason being, in the old rubber hose tanks, these rebreathers would never stay on the frogman's face. So this is just another way to keep that on there. So that goes around his head and pulls it up tight to his mouth. So it's really cool. It works well. I do that with all my dive tanks. So that's this one. Here's one of the tanks I did where I actually created the new harness on the back. You can see it turned out really well. I cast a brand new rebreather, and I also made that new regulator valve as well. It's a little off center, I noticed when I was screwing around. I pushed it a little bit over to the side before the plastic weld set up, but I don't really care. It is what it is. I like the way this one turned out. I like the color. I like the decaling, nice and simple. This is a set I did where I mentioned the section loss that I didn't really sand out great, but I think that's okay because these look weathered and used. I've cast, again, another rebreather. I haven't put the elastic in this one yet, but I have put the hoses on. I made a brand new harness for it as well, so this turned out great too. And then lastly, you saw these tanks as well. Put a brand new rebreather part on, made a brand new harness. Oxygen regulator rebreather harness, and decaled this too. So all 4 tanks turned out great. I have one more set of tanks to do at some later date. But I know this video is a little choppy. covered some things fast and maybe didn't cover some things great, but it just gives you an idea what you can do with broken tanks, that you really shouldn't throw them away. There's always a way to refurbish and bring them back to life. So by the time this video airs, these tanks will probably be in the scuba sets that I sold a while back on eBay. If you've seen the What's in the Shop I did, you'll see these tanks with the scuba sets I put together. But I did want to go through and do a basic build on these scuba tanks to show you guys exactly how I do them. So I hope you really enjoyed this video. Excuse me. I enjoyed doing it. Just trying to kind of give you guys a behind the scenes of how I do stuff. I know there's a lot of people that do things way different than me and probably way better than me. So if you're one of those people, feel free to give me some advice, I guess. But other than that, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe to the page. Hit the notification icon. I've got some more basic builds coming up. So be on the lookout. Until next time, cheers.